The story we begin with tonight is known as the 335 Years' War, a conflict so unusual and so uneventful that most historians almost laugh when they mention it. Yet it remained on record for centuries. To understand this peculiar war, we must step back into the middle of the 17th century, during the long struggle between England and the Netherlands. At that time, the English Civil War was raging, and the Royalists, loyal to King Charles I, had retreated to the far southwest of England. The Isles of Scilly, a small group of islands off the coast of Cornwall, became one of their last strongholds. The Dutch, allied with the parliamentarians who opposed the king, declared war on the Royalists in Scilly in the year 1651. According to Dutch sources, Admiral Martin Tromp sailed with his fleet to the islands and made a formal declaration of war. Yet here lies the curious part. No battles were fought, no cannons were fired, and not a single casualty was recorded. The Dutch fleet soon withdrew, and the war itself faded from memory. But technically, because no peace treaty had been signed, the war remained legally active. Generations passed. Kings and queens rose and fell. Revolutions changed Europe. America was discovered and colonized. Napoleon marched across the continent. And still, somewhere in the forgotten paperwork, this strange war continued. For 3 centuries, nobody remembered, nobody cared, and yet officially, the Isles of Scilly and the Netherlands were in a state of war. It was not until the year 1986 that the situation was finally noticed. Roy Duncan, a historian and chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council, wrote to the Dutch embassy in London, pointing out the forgotten declaration. The Dutch ambassador at the time, Rein Heidekoper, responded with good humor and traveled to the islands to sign a peace treaty. On April 17, 1986, after 335 years, the so-called war was officially brought to an end. No soldiers had been lost, no blood had been shed, and yet this conflict had lasted longer than most great wars of history. It holds a unique record, a war so long, so dull, and so utterly without action that it has become a favorite story among those who enjoy the strange corners of history. Some historians even debate whether it should truly be called a war, since it involved no violence. But the fact that it began with a formal declaration and ended with a formal treaty makes it real enough to earn its place in the record books. When we reflect on it, the thought is almost comical. A war that outlasted empires, revolutions, and entire dynasties, all without firing a single shot. This is how our journey begins, with the longest, quietest, and perhaps most boring war the world has ever known. Our journey into the strange corners of history now takes us to Italy in the year 1325. It is a story that begins not with armies clashing or kings plotting, but with a wooden bucket. Yes, an ordinary bucket. To understand this peculiar event, we must go back to the rivalry between 2 Italian city-states of the Middle Ages, Modena and Bologna. These 2 cities, like many neighbors in medieval Italy, had a long tradition of quarrels, political disputes, and petty insults. But in the year 1325, something truly unusual happened. According to the chronicles, a group of Modenese soldiers raided Bologna territory. Among the items they took was a common wooden bucket, used for drawing water from a well. They carried this bucket back to Modena and displayed it as a kind of trophy, a symbol of their defiance. For Bologna, this theft was more than just a prank. It was seen as a direct insult to their honor, an attack on their dignity. Bologna demanded the return of the bucket. Modena refused, and so, incredibly, a war was declared. The conflict came to be known as the War of the Bucket. Behind the humor of its name, it was actually a real medieval battle. The Bolognese gathered a massive army, said to number nearly 30,000 men. Modena, though smaller, had the advantage of stronger allies and more experienced commanders. The 2 forces finally clashed at the Battle of Zappolino in November 1325. When the armies met, the battle was brief but bloody. Thousands were killed, and Modena ultimately triumphed over the much larger force of Bologna. After their victory, the Modenese carried the wooden bucket back to their city, where it was proudly displayed in their main tower. To this day, more than 7 centuries later, a wooden bucket, believed to be the same one, remains in Modena, preserved as a symbol of that strange and almost comical war. When we think of history's great battles, we often imagine epic struggles for crowns, for empires, or for faith. But here was a war fought over a bucket. A simple, everyday object became the cause of bloodshed, loss, and a tale that still echoes in history books. It is a reminder of how pride and rivalry, even over the smallest things, can escalate into something far greater. And so, after 300 years of silence in the Isles of Scilly, we now find ourselves in Italy, where a single bucket led to armies marching and men dying. History is full of such contradictions. Sometimes wars last for centuries without a single shot, and sometimes they erupt violently over something as humble as a wooden bucket. Our next journey takes us to Rome, at the end of the 9th century, to what might be one of the strangest episodes in church history. It is remembered as the Cadaver Synod, a name as unsettling as the event itself. The year was 897, and Pope Formosus had died the previous year. Ordinarily, when a pope dies, his time is remembered with prayers, with solemn ceremonies, and then his successor leads the church forward. But in this case, things took a bizarre turn. Formosus had been a controversial figure in life. He had enemies, both political and religious. When Pope Stephen VI came to power, he inherited these old rivalries and decided that death was not enough to silence them. So he ordered something almost unthinkable, that Formosus's body, already buried, be exhumed from the grave and brought to trial. And so it was done. The body of the late pope, now reduced to a decayed corpse, was dressed once again in papal robes, placed upon a throne, and formally accused of crimes. A deacon was appointed to answer on behalf of the lifeless figure, while Pope Stephen himself presided over the proceedings. The charges were many: perjury, violation of church law, and ambition. Of course, the corpse said nothing, sitting stiffly on its seat while accusations were shouted across the room. The outcome was already certain. Pope Stephen declared Formosus guilty. The corpse was stripped of its sacred garments, the 3 fingers used for blessings were cut from his hand, and his body was thrown into the river Tiber. It is difficult to imagine a more surreal image. Bishops and priests gathered in solemn robes, candles burning, incense drifting, and at the center of it all, a decayed body in judgment. For the people of Rome, it was both shocking and horrifying. But history did not end there. The people soon turned against Pope Stephen, disgusted by what had happened. Within a year he was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled to death. Later popes declared the Cadaver Synod invalid, and Formosus's body was recovered from the river and reburied with honor. And yet, the story remains. It is as if history itself wanted to preserve this episode as a reminder of how far rivalry and hatred can go, even within the sacred halls of religion. A pope judged another pope, not in life but in death, and in doing so created one of the most bizarre spectacles ever recorded. When we reflect on such moments, we see how strange and unpredictable human history can be. From wars that lasted centuries without a battle, to wars fought over buckets and now a courtroom drama staged with a corpse on trial. Each of these events feels unreal, but all of them are true. Our story now moves to the summer of 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was here that one of the strangest events in medical history unfolded. People began to dance. Not at a festival, not for celebration, but in the streets, uncontrollably, for days and even weeks. It began with a woman named Frau Trophea. One day in July, she stepped into the street and started to dance. There was no music, no gathering, no feast, just her, moving constantly, as if compelled by some invisible force. For hours she danced, and the next day she continued. Within a week, dozens of others had joined her. By the end of the month, the number had grown to more than 400. The city leaders were baffled. At first they thought the cure was more dancing. Musicians were brought in, and halls were opened so the dancers could move more freely. But instead of ending the strange behavior, the music only made it worse. People collapsed from exhaustion, some suffered heart attacks, and others are said to have died from sheer fatigue. What caused the dancing plague? Historians have debated this for centuries. Some suggest it was mass hysteria, a psychological phenomenon born out of stress, famine, and fear. Others believe it may have been caused by ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold that grows on damp rye bread. Still others think it was a mix of superstition and desperation in a time of hardship. Whatever the reason, the outbreak slowly faded after several weeks, leaving behind confusion, fear, and countless stories. The records tell us that this was not the only dancing mania in Europe, but the 1518 outbreak in Strasbourg was the most famous. It is difficult to imagine today, streets filled not with celebration, but with bodies moving endlessly, without rest, as if trapped in their own motion. The sight must have been both mesmerizing and terrifying, a living symbol of how fragile the human mind and body can be when pushed by forces we do not understand. And so we add another strange episode to our journey, from wars that never truly happened, to wars fought over buckets, to trials of the dead, and now to a plague of endless dancing. Each one shows us that history is not only made of kings and empires, but also of moments so unusual that they almost feel like dreams or nightmares. Our final story takes us far from Europe, to the wide-open landscapes of Australia in the early 20th century. It was 1932, the world was still reeling from the Great Depression, and Australian farmers were facing a crisis of their own. Their enemy was not another country, not another army, but a bird. The emu, large, flightless, and surprisingly fast. After World War I, many veterans had been given farmland in Western Australia. They struggled to grow crops in harsh conditions, and when the Great Depression hit, things became worse. To make matters even more difficult, emus, tall birds standing over 6 feet and running faster than a horse, migrated through the farmland in search of food and water. They came in the thousands, trampling fields, eating crops, and leaving destruction behind. The farmers called for help, and the government responded in a most unusual way. They sent the military. Soldiers armed with machine guns were dispatched to deal with the problem. It was, in every sense of the word, a war against birds. But the emus were not easy opponents. They were quick, scattered in small groups, and could outrun soldiers with ease. When the guns opened fire, the birds simply ran in different directions. Attempts to herd them together failed. Even with thousands of rounds fired, the number of birds killed was far fewer than expected. The soldiers soon realized they were fighting a losing battle. Newspaper headlines mocked the campaign, calling it the Emu War. Reports spread that the emus were winning, and that the proud Australian military was being defeated by flocks of flightless birds. By December of 1932, the operation was called off. The birds remained, the crops were still in danger, and the farmers were left to find other solutions. In the end, the Great Emu War was not a victory for the military, but it became a lasting story in history. A reminder that even the best trained soldiers and the most powerful weapons can be humbled by nature. It is a strange conclusion to our journey, from wars that lasted centuries without battles, to battles over buckets, to dead men on trial, to people who could not stop dancing, and finally, to soldiers fighting against birds. Each story shows us that history is not only about power and conquest, but also about the odd, the absurd, and the forgotten. As we close this series, let us remember that history is filled with surprises. Sometimes those surprises are grand, sometimes they are tragic, and sometimes they are simply bizarre. And in these bizarre tales we find a strange kind of comfort, proof that the past was not always serious, that even in times of hardship, humanity stumbled into moments of almost unbelievable strangeness.